Hey, Magnificasters. This week, Dean's away. He's at Catholic summer camp, which is very funny to say. I'm sure he'll have a full report back next week. But even though Dean isn't here, I was able to put together a pretty cool episode with Alex from the Support Jessica Reznicek campaign. If you're not familiar, Jessica Reznicek is a Catholic worker and climate activist from Iowa who was recently indicted by a grand jury in 2019 for a number of acts of sabotage against the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's estimated that her actions cost $6 million in damages by stopping 30 million barrels of oil in the pipeline. And as things stand right now, Jessica is incarcerated and will likely carry out her 8-year sentence. Though, I don't know. I always hope in the future, maybe something will change. In the end, she'll be required to pay something like $3.2 million in restitution. Something that to me seems pretty outrageous. To make matters worse, in the trial, she was labeled as a terrorist for her actions, even though the target of her activism was squarely on the pipelines and no one was hurt at all. That kind of designation will play a pretty big part in the story, so make sure you pay attention when Alex starts talking about that. Before we get to the conversation with Alex, though, I thought it'd be good to include some of Jessica's voice somehow. It's pretty hard since she's incarcerated, but here is a clip of Jessica and her co-conspirator Ruby Montoya addressing the situation back in 2017. It's not as good as having her voice, here, but I think it's a nice way to sort of contextualize the conversation and where this is all coming from.
We are speaking publicly to empower others to act boldly, with purity of heart, to dismantle the infrastructures which deny us our rights to water, land, and liberty. We as civilians have seen the repeated failures of the government, and it is our duty to act with responsibility and integrity, risking our own liberty for the sovereignty of us all.
Some may view these actions as violent, but be not mistaken. We acted from our hearts and never threatened human life nor personal property. What we did do was fight a private corporation that has run rapidly across our country, seizing land and polluting our nation's water supply.
Again, that was Jessica Reznicek and Ruby Montoya from 2017. There are two things that really strike me when it comes to the Jessica Reznicek story. When it comes to climate change, it's hard not to feel like things are desperate and bleak. Recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that we're already on track and basically guaranteed for a 1.2 degrees Celsius average increase in global warming. And if we don't drastically change our patterns of consumption and production, things will just get worse. And when you tell people those kinds of facts, they usually get pretty down and think it's kind of hopeless. Those big gloomy numbers and a foreknowledge of, obstructionist politicians who care more about the profits of oil companies than they do people can make us feel pretty doomed. And if you listen to this podcast, you've heard it all before. We've talked about it quite a bit. Jessica Reznicek, however, acted on her conscience with full knowledge of how dire things were, and she chose to do something that I think is pretty courageous. I'm not recommending anyone go out and sabotage an oil pipeline, but in the face of an existential threat like climate change, it's imperative that we, like Jessica, find ways to act that pump the brakes on the production of fossil fuels. The second thing that really sticks out to me about Jessica's witness is that she's not simply engaging in activism for a purely pragmatic reason. As Alex will make clear in a few minutes, there's a real spiritual aspect to her work and her activism that I think is really interesting, and maybe we can think about how we would emulate it or something. Jessica's actions follow from her practice of contemplation and conscience. It's pretty obvious that her activism kind of flows out of her faith, and that's a cool thing to see. So I think that there's a lot to take away from her life and her witness as an activist, and maybe you'll find yourself disagreeing with her actions, and you're welcome to feel that way. But disagree or not, it's important that we as Christian people and fellow activists hold the government accountable when they start labeling people like Jessica as a terrorist and continue to ignore the problem of climate change. It's not good, and it's not going to make anything better. All right, without any more rambling from me, here's Alex. Thanks for coming on the show, Alex. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. Whenever we have a guest on our show, we always just ask them to introduce themselves. So can you tell us who you are, what you're about, and what campaign you're working with?
Yeah, thanks for having us. My name's Alex Cohen. I'm a climate justice organizer, and I'm a member of the Free Jessica Reznicek support team. I believe in the intersection of climate change and its impact on humanity. So while I love the environment and nature, what really draws me to climate and environmental organizing is the impact on humans. So I'm interested in the intersections of stopping the expansion of fossil fuels via pipelines or any infrastructure that is, expanding the fossil fuel industry at a time when we need to stop all new expansion and, eliminate all existing fossil fuels. But I'm also interested in learning how to create systems and networks to take care of people that are certainly going to be impacted by the increasing climate crisis that we're in right now. So I try to and stay involved in disaster relief organizing, mutual aid networks, migrant justice work as well. On top of that, that's stopping the problem and also trying to, build up and build networks to support each other as well.
Well, we're here to mostly talk about Jessica Reznicek, but it's great to hear about you too. So Jessica's story is a really fascinating one. It's something I've been following for a while. But as someone who's working closely with her and like on her campaign, you're doing what you can to support her now that she's been incarcerated. How would you tell her story to people who are unfamiliar? I know that's kind of an awkward thing since, you're not her, but how would you do it?
Yeah, I guess I would start with the day I met Jessica, and that was in 2016. I was headed, the DNC had just happened, and people were kind of feeling disempowered after all that, and people were talking about, hey, there's a, indigenous group that is preparing to fight the Dakota Access Pipeline. So people should head to North Dakota. So I went home to St. Louis, which is my home, and I was getting ready to head to North Dakota. And as I was doing that, I heard this person on the radio named Jessica Reznicek on St. Louis Public Radio, being like, I'm in a ditch alone in Iowa, and there's no one here, and I'm trying to resist this pipeline. Please come join me. So I was like, well, she seems pretty cool and seems like she needs help. So instead of going to North Dakota where everyone was going, I went to Iowa, and it was only 3 hours north of St. Louis. So we went with a crew of people from St. Louis. It's the first time I met Jessica, and I learned that she had showed up by herself to this access road where they were drilling underneath the Mississippi River. And by herself, she set up a blockade and waited for the trucks to come in the morning. She was arrested, released 24 hours later. She did it again, was arrested, released 24 hours later, and she asked the sheriff where she could be without being arrested, and he pointed to the ditch. So she set up a tent on the ditch and, eventually asked the world to join her. And people did, hundreds eventually would come to this ditch, and she kind of fomented this direct action resistance in Iowa. And the coolest thing about it, I think, was through this process, I got to learn who Jessica was. I got to become her friend, and I got to really watch her in her element. And that was to be like surrounded by community and really organizing people and resources in a way that was really special to watch.
That's really incredible. I love that. What a great story. Just Jessica Reznicek in a ditch, and then everyone else comes. It's fantastic. How does that spin out to like the rest of the story? How does that, I guess from there, how does she get to, sabotaging pipelines and stuff?
Yeah, so the campaign in the ditch with Jessica and what was called Mississippi Stand lasted about a month and a half. And eventually we were evicted from the ditch, and there was a different property where some people moved to. And at that point, Jessica kind of went back to Des Moines. She's a Catholic worker. She went back to the Catholic worker community in Des Moines. And she kind of regrouped and was trying to figure out ways to fight this. She was pretty disempowered after we were evicted from the ditch and wasn't feeling like that collective resistance was her journey anymore. So she actually started a hunger strike in front of the Iowa Utilities Board. And during this hunger strike, her and one other person basically sat and fasted for 10 days in front of the Iowa Utilities Board, demanding they stop the pipeline. They didn't revoke the permits. A lot of people came and supported Jessica, but again, the pipeline did not shut down. And this followed before both of these campaigns, where she was involved for years locally, going to public hearings and doing all this, and she continued to become more disillusioned. And as she said, she became to get more desperate, thinking this pipeline had to stop. And so at that point, she went on her own and kind of disconnected from everyone and with one other person, and they disabled parts of the pipeline before it was active, before there was oil flowing through.
Yeah, that's an amazing story to kind of see her go from one place to the next. It's good to help kind of contextualize what's going on there. Well, a lot of the media around Jessica's trial and activism, I think, is really interesting. And I've just been reading like interviews with her and kind of trying to get a feel for like what she's all about. And it's I don't know. It's a complicated thing to know somebody through like interviews like that. I guess you probably have a pretty different perspective knowing her more as an activist and a person. In that media, I think a lot of people like characterize her as like like somebody in the tradition of Catholic anti-war protesters, like Daniel Berrigan or somebody. Someone who's willing to do vandalism, but along these like sort of lines of their faith. And to me, that makes sense. But I don't know. What do you think? Does that seem like an appropriate comparison? Is that sort of the vein that she, her activism is coming out of, or do you think that it's something different?
100%. She's been a Catholic worker for 11 years. She's inspired by the Plowshares tradition. She actually did a Plowshares action before this Plowshares action in 2015, I believe, at Northrop Grumman, where she went to the headquarters of Northrop Grumman and she used a hammer and broke the windows at the war manufacturer's office. And she represented herself in trial. She spent 3 months in prison, and at the end, she actually won her trial. She got the felony reduced to a misdemeanor and got time served when she was representing herself. But yeah, she definitely comes out of the Catholic worker tradition. She actually lived in the Berrigan house at the Des Moines Catholic worker community, and the two cats at the house were Phil and Dan. The community she lives in and her own tradition herself was definitely inspired by that. And before she moved back to Iowa, when she was on house arrest, she was living with nuns in a monastery up in Minneapolis, and that continues to be her spiritual support community, a community that advocated for her, pleaded with the judge to give her a shorter sentence and not call her a terrorist, and kind of where she still draws her stability even in prison.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's great. I bet those cats, they're always on the run. When it comes to activism in the tradition of like the Catholic worker, I guess what comes to mind is people who are really acting on their conscience. They are encountering something unjust and terrible in the world, and they can't live their lives knowing that's kind of happening, right? So I think it's always interesting to see how conscience plays a role in that type of activism. I don't know. Would you say that's characteristic of how Jessica Reznicek acts and moves out of the environmental justice space? I guess, like, is that how you'd characterize her resistance? Is it an act of conscience, or is it, I don't know, something different?
Yeah, I think I'd be interested to hear her answer. I can say is like, through hearing her talk about this, is that something that is like really important to her before she takes any action is this idea of contemplation. And like sitting with the decision, right? Nothing is rash. Like everything she's done, she does with intention, and she's sat with before, and she's weighed all the consequences and was willing to face whatever consequences, knowing that action was of a greater value to humanity, to her conscience, to the collective consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I like the contemplative aspect of it. I think that's really, pretty inspiring. What would she say is like the greater good of her action? I feel like somebody who is maybe more cynical might look at her story and be like, well, it's someone who, disassembled parts of a pipeline, and maybe that's like great for the short term, but what does it get people long term, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my opinion, a lot of, and history shows that direct action is what has delivered results for people, material results for people. In terms of Jessica's actions in particular, again, I wish she was here to respond to that. But what I can say is that, the No DAPL movement as a whole, which Jessica is a part of, I think created a movement against pipelines that was worth every bit of that struggle, because I don't know a pipeline being built now that isn't receiving some form of direct action resistance against it. And that was not the case before the Dakota Access Pipeline. There was Keystone, but it's very focused on Keystone. What we saw after Dakota Access Pipeline was like a spread out of the movement, and people really just like resisting this in their backyards and in their front yards, and I'm taking what they learned and really, really trying to resist the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in the age of the climate crisis. And I think looking at the No DAPL movement, that's something I try to pull inspiration from, is that like our movement grew. And I truly believe that, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and other pipelines were canceled because of that would not have been canceled, whether it, wasn't DAPL alone. But now we're seeing the leftover residual effect of that.
Yeah, that's a great way to tell the story because, the way that the official media would tell it is just, Jessica Reznicek's story is kind of like a blip in a larger sea of climate activism. But I think that's right. I think it makes sense that she kind of gives some some energy and some power to that movement longer term. I think that's cool. I like that. So how should Jessica Reznicek's activism inform us as activists who are concerned about climate change? I mean, you yourself are very concerned about that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and you're organizing people in that area. So I don't know, what do you think it is, what can we learn from her witness, from her activism? What's there to take away, do you think?
I think the big takeaway for me, and this is coming from someone who's involved in, the campaign to free her and the legal team and all that, is that this is the harshest we've seen the state respond to any protest against pipelines. The first time we've seen a domestic terrorism enhancement used against, the modern day climate justice movement. Of course, we had the Green Scare in the early 2000s, but so to me, it's that zoom out and look at the globe, and it's that, which is what we're trying to do at the campaign. And it's like the world is heating up, and so is fascism, and these two are interconnected. And as the climate crisis gets worse, naturally people are going to respond in more drastic ways. And I'm not sure that we are prepared to respond to the way the state is going to respond to those who take action. And so we're kind of seeing that across the globe right now, right? The Philippines are introducing terrorism laws for environmental protesters. In the UK, they just introduced a law in response to Extinction Rebellion that you can't film the police. In the global south, murder of indigenous activists by corporations, many of them U.S., and governments are going up, those that are protecting the land and water in the global south. And just in Africa last month, environmental headquarters was raided for suspicion of terrorism. So we're kind of seeing the U.S. set the stage and tell the world it's okay, right, to label people terrorists who have never killed someone, never had the intent to kill someone, never even committed a crime of terrorism or pled guilty to a crime of terrorism. But it's okay to just slide in this enhancement and give them this label, for trying to literally save life and protect life. And so I think for me, that's where my brain is right now, because I'm so involved in the campaign, is how do we protect the protectors, and how do we figure out how to take care of people who are going to inevitably take risk because, our life depends on it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Given, so you mentioned the Green Scare a minute ago, and, the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, and, those folks were labeled terrorists early on, and which is very complicated and, I don't know, in my opinion, bad. But I guess the thing that sticks out to me that's so bonkers about the Jessica Reznicek case, though, is that she disassembled heavy tools where no one was around. I don't know. To me, the court labeled her as a terrorist. If people who are listening to this didn't know that, you probably do know by now. I'll put it in the introduction for sure. But anyways, they labeled her a terrorist, but it just doesn't really make sense to me how they came to that decision. I don't know. Can you talk about that piece a little bit?
Yeah, she was originally charged with 9 felonies, and she was facing up to 120 years to prison. She pled guilty to 1 in agreement to drop all the other 9 if she admitted, in this plea agreement to everything she did. So it dropped all the 9, and she pled guilty to the only one that didn't have a mandatory minimum, and that was 0 to 20 years was the sentencing guideline. None of these were crimes of terrorism. They were things like, destruction of property or arson or things like that. None of them were federal crimes of terrorism. They were all federal felony charges. So she pled guilty to conspiracy to damage an energy facility, and it was the only one without a mandatory minimum. No word of the terrorism enhancement was brought up in this process, over these years. No one was expecting this. Her legal team wasn't expecting this. Kind of as things went on, the political pressure grew because of the fossil fuel industry, and 84 Congress people, 80 Republicans, and 4 Democrats wrote a letter to Jeff Sessions to apply a terrorism enhancement at her sentencing. So the terrorism enhancement can be applied to anyone charged with a federal crime at sentencing, similar to like a hate crime enhancement or something like that. And basically at sentencing, no matter what they're charged with, the prosecution can ask for it, the federal government, and then the judge can either accept it or deny it. But a judge can't impose it on its own. The Department of Justice has to request it. So 84 people sent this letter to Jeff Sessions asking the Justice Department to pursue it at the sentencing. It's at this point we learn that this is kind of like a political ambition and things that are going on. Well, Trump is gone, Biden's Department of Justice is in. We think maybe, this won't work. And even if they do this enhancement, there's no way a judge will agree to it because the enhancement is reserved for actions against the United States government or its employees or property. Very specifically, nowhere in it does it say anything about private corporations, government contractors. I mean, it's very specific to the U.S. government. So we get to sentencing, a new Justice Department, and they're still pursuing the terrorism enhancement. Again, the legal team and people don't think the judge is going to take this seriously and that it's mostly political posturing. But the judge applied to it, and the judge applied it and basically said, and so this increased her sentencing guide range by 5-fold. So instead of looking at a range of 1 to 3 years, she was looking at a range of like 5 to 15, and the judge gave her 8. So, and the judge basically said because of her words. So the gold star, as the prosecution claimed, both at her sentencing and then at her appeal hearing, which she lost her appeal as well, was that because she was critical of the regulatory process of the U.S. government in her words, therefore her actions against the private corporation, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was retaliation. So they used a very convoluted way to both say that, her words are not protected First Amendment speech and that those could be weaponized against her. And then on the second hand, compared a pipeline corporation to the United States government. So that's kind of where we're at now. And this decision was appealed to the 8th Circuit Court, and the 8th Circuit Court basically said, yeah, this enhancement was probably wrong. We're not going to make a decision on whether it was right or wrong. We're going to punt on that, but we're going to say that it doesn't matter either way. It was a harmless error because the judge would have sentenced her to 8 years in prison anyways, which is not true.
Yeah, that seems hard to buy. First of all, that's wild. That's part of the story I didn't know, and awful. So you mentioned that all of these like Congress people had to write letters to get this like the terrorism label applied. Like, what was the impetus for them doing that? I mean, if you don't know, it's okay, but like that seems like such a wild thing for a group of people who probably like weren't paying attention to the case in the first place to suddenly do.
I don't know specifically, but ABC News did report that the 84 people who wrote this letter, they received $36 million in fossil fuel contributions.
Okay.
So I can't say specifically, but these are all very, these are representatives who introduced ALEC legislation to criminalize protests. They're, bought and paid for by the fossil fuel industry. And we know Dakota Access Pipeline and the American Petroleum Institute ran a specific campaign against Jessica and Ruby. And, at the time, Kelsey Warren was on a speaking tour saying people like Jessica and Ruby should be removed from the gene pool, implying that they're less than human and, inhumane things should happen to them. So they definitely became a target of the of the fossil fuel industry campaign against climate protesters. And in that same letter that the 84 Congress people wrote, it said, it didn't name anyone, but it said people who pierce holes through pipelines. And it said the valve turners should also be labeled as terrorists.
Wild. Man, that is such a frustrating thing. But I guess kind of what you'd expect, I suppose, from, that makes a lot of sense in the context of, in the larger context of the U.S. sort of setting the stage for how the world's going to deal with climate protesters. Turning a little bit in the conversation, I guess. So Jessica's been in prison for 365 days. Well, more than that now, but last week marked that 365th day. And you all on the campaign, you had sort of a digital action around that, and you asked people to kind of post pictures and, to speak about it a bit. Yeah, I don't know. What was your goal of the action? Do you think that it worked? I don't know. What's like the aim of the campaign sort of moving forward?
Totally. So our big thing, actually, this is a little interesting backstory, is Jessica comes from the Catholic worker tradition. So she owned up to everything she did, right? And she was willing to face the consequences. There wasn't really going to be a support team or a campaign to free her, because we assumed under her guidelines she'd get 1 to 3 years, and that was something she contemplated. This only became a campaign was the day the judge agreed to the terrorism enhancement after her sentencing. And we were like, with Jessica, like, whoa, this has implications far greater than your case. And obviously this is not just, for one, it's not legal, and this is not, something you contemplated with. So that's kind of like where the campaign came from. So we're making connections globally, which is a huge part of the campaign, to try and connect this trend to protesters being criminalized. And then the second part is getting Jessica out of prison as quickly as possible and trying to reverse this precedent in the United States. So the first strategy was the appeal to the 8th Circuit Court, which happened in, I want to say 3 months ago now. That was since she had been in, the appeal was filed, and we were working on that all the way up until the oral arguments. So a bunch of different organizations followed, amicus briefs, friend of the courts of briefs, in support of Jessica, saying that this terrorism enhancement is wrong. There's really an interesting 4 amicus briefs that were filed. If anyone is into this kind of thing, and to really hear the legal argument of how dangerous this is, and they all focus on different areas. One is on international law by the Center for Constitutional Rights, which basically says, like, if Jessica can be deemed a terrorist in the United States, that the United States will move so far beyond an international consensus on what terrorism is that it will be operating rogue in a different realm of the international court of governments across the world. There's one that the National Lawyers Guild and the Water Protector Legal Collective filed, and that basically shows, like, again, what does this mean for Indigenous people in the United States of America, Jessica being labeled a terrorist, and what does the appellate court have a responsibility to First Nations via treaty law, in the implication of this enhancement in a movement that was led by Indigenous people. There was a brief filed by a group called Catholic Social Action. It was filed by Catholic attorneys, and it uses the Pope's encyclical about climate change in 2015 and all of that to basically say, like, Jessica was acting out of faith in Catholic tradition. And the last one was by a bunch of different organizations from the peace movement, like Code Pink, including climate groups like Honor the Earth and different groups like that. And this one was basically focused on, the legality, the technicality that Jessica is not a terrorism based on the definition of the terrorism enhancement. And then the second half is a really well-constructed argument that's kind of like a necessity defense that says pipelines are more dangerous than those who protest them. So those are really great. They're all on the website. And but unfortunately, we lost that appeal. And so where we are now is we're in an in-between phase where we're consulting with Jessica, we're consulting with other attorneys, and the most important thing we can be doing right now is building up just awareness about her case, because the fight has just begun, and we want to use this time to build, mass support for her appeal, because the direction we're headed is most likely a campaign to seek presidential pardon for Jessica. So that's kind of where we're at right now, where we don't have like direct ask, except for if people share the petition and build that up, then you'll not only sign the petition that will eventually go to the president, but it will also get you on the email list to stay up to date on kind of what will happen next while we're in this in-between phase.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, it's frustrating as well, but it's cool that you hear about so many people kind of coming together. I always think it's really interesting when like someone like Jessica or another like radical person of faith or whatever, they come out and do something and it gains that kind of solidarity and support. I don't know. Are there any interesting connections that are made sort of in that solidarity, like between religious people and environmental groups that are surprising, or does it seem all kind of what you'd expect?
I think that the interesting or things that are surprising to me maybe about like people who are kind of showing up would be some of more of the mainstream institutional climate organizations that are kind of showing up right now. Of course, in the amicus brief, you can see this very intersectional group that showed up to put their names on paper and enter it into the record in federal court to say, like, Jessica's not a terrorist. But, we're seeing like Sunrise, Rainforest Action Network, 350.org. Like, we're seeing these national groups who play with direct action, but, maybe want to, chain themselves to a pipeline or something, kind of come here and say, we're going to put our name on this petition. Like, Jessica's not a terrorist, and this does affect us all. And that has been very cool and very surprising to see this kind of wide base of support and this wide understanding of what happens to Jessica happens to all of us. We're also seeing it from the scientific community, the climate science community, including lead authors of the IPCC, kind of sign on and write public declarations saying what's happening to Jessica, is not okay.
Yeah, that's really cool to see how I guess the Jessica's politicization of the pipelines and of climate issues kind of radicalized more people who are I don't know more liberal than radical, I suppose. So that's great. Okay, well, moving forward, you said you're kind of in this like in between phase, and that's totally fine and understandable, I guess. But how could people get involved in the campaign? What would you all want them to do? Where could they find more information on Jessica Reznicek and her situation? Yeah, I don't know, all of that stuff.
Yeah, so we're in the in-between phase, but like I was saying, the best way is to get on the petition, and like we really want to encourage people to what is helpful no matter what phase the campaign is getting people to know Jessica's story. And so people can do that by going to the website, which is Support Jessica Reznicek.com. You can remember how to spell Jessica's last name by thinking like Reznicek. And Support Jessica Reznicek.com. And on there you can buy a shirt, which is a cool way to spread the word, and part of the proceeds go to the campaign to free her. It's a really amazing shirt with the design on the front did by an indigenous artist, and it has a red wing bird on it, which is Jessica's favorite bird. It's one way to support. You can also find the petition on there. Again, if you sign the petition, you can get your name on the email list. But beyond those things, we ask people, and you can also write Jessica a letter, and you can find that on the website as well in prison. But we will have a ton of asks in the future. And so the best way to find out about those asks is to either follow us on social media, which is at Free Jess Rez, or by signing the petition and getting your name on the email list. And then do things on your own. So like we've been encouraging people, like if you're going to a climate justice protest, make a sign that says Free Jessica Reznicek and put the website on it. If you're want to do a banner drop over a highway that says Free Jessica Reznicek, like do that and take a picture and post it on your social media and tag us. Write an op-ed. There was this really amazing op-ed that came out in Canada, and someone from 350 in Canada said, what can we do? And so we sent a list. We were like, what I'm doing now, take a sign to a protest, write an op-ed. And he wrote an op-ed and he got it published in like the CNBC, I think it is, like the national big Canadian thing about Jessica's case. So one person asked what he could do. We gave him a list. He did one of the things and got it in a national news publication. So, kind of get creative. And right now, just think about how can I spread the word about Jessica's case, maybe a little every day. Is that telling someone about it? Is that sharing stuff on social media, making a sign or writing an op-ed? And, in the meantime, stick around with us and wait for our updates and tag us, with all the things you come up with. And we will definitely have clear ask on who to call and all of that eventually once the next phase of this campaign starts.
That's awesome. That's some good homework to do. I appreciate it. Always good to have a nice list of things. All right, Alex, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate you talking us through the Jessica Reznicek case. And man, it's such a cool thing to hear about, and also kind of a bummer, but good to be in the know, I think.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you subscribe at $2 or more, you get access to our cool invite-only Discord, where we talk about all kinds of things. Sometimes we read books together. Sometimes we share recipes. Sometimes we just post pictures of our pets, and it's all good. Nice to have a community to go along with the podcast, for sure. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have